The Great Siege of Malta. Shields of faith, swords of steel. In the scorching summer of 1565, the fate of Western civilization hung by a thread on a small, rocky Mediterranean island, scarcely 3 times the size of Manhattan. Here, on Malta, 700 Knights of St. John, warrior monks with flowing beards and steel resolve, alongside 8,000 soldiers and civilians, faced the full might of the Ottoman Empire. 40,000 battle-hardened troops commanded by Suleiman the Magnificent's most skilled generals. What followed was not merely a siege, but an apocalyptic clash of wills. 78 days of unimaginable brutality, where men fought with such savage determination that the limestone battlements ran red with blood, and both Christian and Muslim alike wondered if God himself had abandoned this scorched theater of war. Jean Parisot de la Valette stood at the southern ramparts of Birgu, his weathered hand resting on sun-baked limestone as he gazed across the Grand Harbour. At 67, the Grand Master's face was a map of old wounds, a missing eye from an Ottoman arrow, a lattice of scars from decades of holy warfare, and the deeper, invisible marks left by 4 years in an Algerian prison galley. Dawnlight caught the silver of his beard as he studied the horizon where intelligence reports promised doom would soon appear. Behind him, the island's preparations continued with fevered urgency. Cisterns filled, grain stockpiled, women and children evacuated to inland Mdina. La Valette knew better than most what was coming. 4 decades earlier, he had witnessed the Knights' catastrophic loss of Rhodes, their previous stronghold, to Suleiman. Now the Sultan, in his 70s and seeking one final conquest for Allah, had turned his gaze toward Malta. The Knights had not asked for this rocky, barren outpost when Emperor Charles V offered it in 1530. After 7 years of homelessness, following their expulsion from Rhodes, however, they had little choice. Malta possessed magnificent natural harbors, but little else. No timber for shipbuilding, minimal agriculture, and a chronic shortage of fresh water. Yet the warrior monks had transformed this unpromising rock into a naval base that now terrorized Ottoman shipping across the Mediterranean. Their galleys, flying the white cross on red, captured Turkish merchantmen, freed Christian slaves, and returned with holds full of Muslim prisoners and stolen goods. These raids had become more than a theological irritant. They were now a strategic obstruction to Ottoman power. In Constantinople, war councils convened by Suleiman reached an inevitable conclusion. Malta must fall. Throughout the winter of 1564-65, arsenals across the Ottoman Empire echoed with preparations, foundries casting massive siege cannons, shipwrights reinforcing galleys, quartermasters stockpiling munitions. Suleiman assigned his 2 most capable commanders to the task, the 80-year-old Land General Mustafa Pasha and the brilliant naval strategist Piali Pasha. Their orders were unequivocal: crush the Knights utterly, claiming Malta as the stepping stone for Islam's advance into Sicily, then Italy itself. When La Valette's spies brought word of the armada's scale, some 200 ships carrying 40,000 men, the Grand Master faced a brutal arithmetic. His force numbered just 700 knights, backed by roughly 8,000 Spanish troops and Maltese militia. Appeals for help brought sympathetic words from European courts, but few reinforcements. The powers of Christendom were mired in their own conflicts, with many seeing the Knights as anachronistic relics rather than Europe's essential shield. "We are the dead men who still fight," La Valette told his knights in the conventual church of St. Lawrence, his voice echoing off ancient stones. "Prepare your souls for death or victory, for there shall be no middle path." As the knights filed past him to take communion, each man knew the Grand Master spoke truth. This would not be a battle from which quarter would be asked or given. When the Ottoman sails appeared on the horizon, Each defender would stand against an enemy who outnumbered him 5-1, with their backs to a sea that offered no escape. The Ottoman fleet appeared on May 18, 1565, a forest of masts and sails stretching across the eastern horizon. The sentinel atop Mdina's ancient watchtower fired the alarm cannon, its boom echoing across Malta's scrubby landscape as church bells pealed in frantic warning. From Fort St. Elmo, perched on the tip of the Skyberis Peninsula, the Hospitaller knight Francisco Bolbi di Correggio, who would later chronicle the siege, watched the sea transform before his eyes. "First came the fighting galleys," he wrote, their banks of oars moving like the legs of great water insects. Then the massive galleasses, floating fortresses bearing the heaviest artillery, and behind them the transports laden with men and beasts and engines of war. By nightfall, the armada had disgorged its first wave of janissaries onto the shores of Marsaxlokk Bay on the island's southeastern coast. Malta's defences were a patchwork testament to ingenuity battling scarcity. With minimal funds and labour, the knights had constructed a triangle of fortifications controlling the Grand Harbour, the small Fort St. Elmo, and the larger bastions of Birgu and Senglea, reinforced by hasty earthworks and outposts. La Valette had made ruthless decisions in the preceding months, poisoning wells outside the fortifications, burning crops that couldn't be harvested, and most controversially, executing Ottoman prisoners rather than feeding them through a siege. Within the walls, every civilian had assigned duties: women and children preparing bandages and carrying water, boys as young as 10 serving as messengers, old men manning fire brigades. Meanwhile, Turkish commanders executed their first tactical masterstroke. Capturing the high ground of Mount Siberus, they dragged massive bronze siege cannons, some weighing over 7,000 pounds and firing 160-pound stone balls, into position. As the defenders watched this meticulous deployment, Maltese engineer Evangelista Vienne approached La Valette with an urgent report on their gunpowder reserves. "If we fire at their current rate," he whispered, "our magazines will be empty within 20 days. The Grand Master nodded grimly. "Then we shall make every shot strike true," he replied, "and when powder fails, we still have steel." The Ottoman bombardment began at dawn on May 24th, over 100 cannons firing in synchronized fury. Fort St. Elmo, designed to withstand naval assault rather than a land siege, trembled under the onslaught. Built to house 60 men, it now sheltered 400, a mix of knights, Spanish harquebusiers, and Maltese militia commanded by the knight Luigi Broglia. The small fort's strategic value far outweighed its modest size. As long as Christians held it, the Ottoman fleet could not safely enter the Marsamset harbour. Mustafa Pasha had expected to reduce this minor inconvenience within days. "St. Elmo will fall like a ripened plum," he reportedly told his war council. Yet the first infantry assault on May 27th revealed the defenders' resolve. Waves of janissaries in their distinctive white caps and blue tunics crashed against the walls, only to be repulsed by coordinated harquebus fire, boiling oil, and incendiary hoops of flaming pitch that transformed climbing Turks into human torches. Across the water in Birgu, La Valette received nightly reports via swimmers crossing the harbour under cover of darkness. When St. Elmo's commander requested permission to abandon the increasingly devastated fort, the Grand Master's reply was uncompromising: "Others must come to die with you." Yet he matched this severity with inspiration, personally leading a relief force of 40 knights who rowed across the harbour in small boats, braving Turkish gunfire to bring fresh defenders. Each night the wounded were evacuated the same way. Men with ghastly injuries floating silently back to Birgu on quiet oars. The Ottoman frustration grew as days stretched into weeks, with the tiny fort still resisting. Dragut, the feared corsair admiral, called the drawn sword of Islam, arrived on June 2nd with reinforcements and immediately altered the tactical approach. "You have fired more shot against this one small fort," he chastised the other pashas, "than the Sultan used to capture all of Rhodes." Under his guidance, new Turkish batteries targeted not just the fort, but the crossing points between St. Elmo and Birgu, isolating the defenders who could now watch salvation across the water but could no longer reach it. As the June sun baked the limestone fortifications white-hot, both Christians and Muslims understood that St. Elmo had become an arena where the siege's spiritual battle was being fought, a crucible where each side would demonstrate how much blood they were willing to sacrifice for their God. By mid-June, Fort St. Elmo had become unrecognizable, its stone walls pulverized into rubble, its courtyard a charnel house of splintered wood and mangled bodies. The knights now fought from behind improvised barricades, sleeping in shallow holes scratched from the debris. On June 17th, a Turkish cannonball struck Admiral Dragut as he supervised the placement of new batteries, mortally wounding the corsair who had terrorized Christian shipping for decades. His death was kept secret from the Ottoman troops, but the loss enraged Mustafa Pasha, who ordered unprecedented fury against St. Elmo. "I shall take this fort, even if it rains fire from heaven," he vowed. That night, Ottoman sappers completed a mine beneath the Ravelin, the fort's triangular outwork, and at dawn, the explosion tore open the defenses. Through the breach poured elite Yayalars, Janissaries who had sworn to return either victorious or dead. Inside the shattered fort, Knight Captain Medran gathered the last 70 defenders into the chapel. "This is our Golgotha," he told them as they knelt for final communion. "We die that Malta might live." The chaplain, Friar William, broke consecrated hosts into fragments. There were not enough to go around. The defenders then embraced, asking forgiveness for past quarrels before taking their positions. What followed was not a battle, but an execution. The knights, many too wounded to stand, fought from chairs and on their knees. The end came on June 23rd, after 31 days of continuous combat. From Birgu's walls, La Valette and his commanders watched helplessly as the crescent banner rose over St. Elmo's ruins. Mustafa's vengeance was terrible. Captured knights were beheaded, their bodies nailed to crucifixes and set adrift toward Birgu. In a final desecration, the hearts were cut from the corpses before they were cast into the harbor. But Turkish victory celebrations turned somber when an aide whispered the cost to Mustafa: over 8,000 Ottoman dead, including 4,000 of his elite Janissaries, sacrificed to capture a fort that engineers had promised would fall in 3 days. Looking across the Grand Harbor toward the much larger fortifications of Birgu and Senglea, the old general muttered words that rippled through the Ottoman camp. "Allah, if so small a son has cost us so dear, what price shall we pay for the father?" With St. Elmo's fall, the Ottoman guns pivoted toward Birgu and Senglea, the twin fortresses straddling the Grand Harbor where La Valette had concentrated his remaining strength. On July 15th, the full fury of the Turkish artillery unleashed upon these strongholds. 180 guns firing ceaselessly, hurling over 7,000 rounds in a single day, shattering walls and transforming the air into a haze of limestone dust and cordite. From his command post in the Auberge of Castile, La Valette dictated orders through the din as masonry crashed around him. When a knight suggested moving to a safer location, the Grand Master shot him a withering glance. "If this is where the danger lies, this is where I stand." Across the water, Ottoman engineers labored to construct an audacious weapon, a massive floating bridge of linked boats and barrels intended to deliver troops directly to Senglea's weakest point. On July 15th, Mustafa launched his boldest stroke, a two-pronged assault with thousands of troops attacking Birgu's landward walls, while the floating bridge deployed against Senglea. The attackers had prepared meticulously, studying the fortifications through spies and identifying a weak point in Senglea's defenses, an unprotected water gate where supplies were normally unloaded. What they hadn't discovered was La Valette's secret weapon, a concealed battery of guns positioned at water level, masked by reeds and revealed only at the critical moment. As Turkish troops rushed across the floating bridge, these cannons fired chains and grape shot that scythed through the densely packed attackers. Simultaneously, Maltese swimmers slipped beneath the bridge, sawing at ropes and placing explosive charges that shattered the structure into fragments. The men crossing it plunged into the harbor, where most, weighted by armor, drowned immediately. Those who reached Senglea's walls met knights who fought with the desperate energy of men who had long accepted death. By sunset, the waters of the Grand Harbour had turned crimson with Turkish blood, and the floating bridge attack had become a symbol of Ottoman frustration. Ingenious plans dashed against the unyielding will of defenders who simply refused to recognize defeat. By early August, the siege entered its darkest phase. Food dwindled to mouthfuls of horsemeat and rats. Water became so precious that sentries monitored cisterns with drawn swords. The summer heat reached unbearable intensity, breeding typhus and dysentery that claimed defenders whom Turkish bullets had spared. Mustafa's sappers drove tunnels beneath Birgu's walls, detonating mines that opened yawning breaches in key sections of the post of Castile. The knight's own counterminers, led by the engineer Pietro Pardo, dug listening shafts where men pressed ears against the earth, timing Ottoman digging with hourglasses to calculate the position of enemy tunnels. When they intercepted one, savage hand-to-hand fighting erupted in narrow, suffocating passages by the light of guttering torches. La Valette personally led counterattacks to seal breaches, fighting alongside common soldiers in brutal melees where armor became a deadly liability in the heat. When hit by an Ottoman arquebus, the Grand Master continued battling with a pike despite the wound, rejecting attempts to remove him from the front line. "Here I shall die," he reportedly told his knights, "for what more noble end could an old man desire?" Within the knights' inner circles, a more insidious danger emerged. A Turkish prisoner revealed under torture that a renegade knight was sending coded messages to the Ottoman camp. The traitor, a French knight named Laparelli, had been sharing details of the defense's weakest points and ammunition stores. La Valette ordered his immediate arrest, then staged a chilling demonstration. Rather than a public execution that might reveal their vulnerability, he had Laparelli secretly garroted in a dungeon while spreading word that the spy had been placed in a prominent position. For days afterward, Ottoman assaults targeted empty sections of wall while leaving actual weak points untouched. The psychological warfare reached its crescendo on August 18th, the Night of Fire, when Ottoman troops silently scaled Birgu's southern wall in darkness. They had nearly captured the post of Castile when a sentry's chance discovery triggered alarm bells. In the confused moonlit battle that followed, defenders fought in nightshirts and hastily donned helmets, some barefoot and half-armed. The fighting was so desperate that Maltese women joined the fray, pouring boiling oil and pitching burning bundles onto the attackers below. By dawn, the attack had been repulsed, but the margin between survival and annihilation had narrowed to a knife's edge. "Our walls now consist only of flesh and courage," La Valette wrote in his dispatch to the Viceroy of Sicily, "and even these are failing." On August 23rd, a lookout atop Medina's cathedral tower spotted movement on the northern horizon. 4 galleys flying the Cross of Spain, cautiously approaching under cover of darkness. These vessels carried the Piccolo Soccorso, Little Relief, some 700 men under the command of Don Melchior de Robles, a fraction of the reinforcements promised by Spanish Viceroy Don Garcia de Toledo. The larger relief force remained in Sicily, ostensibly delayed by storms and preparations. Rather than landing at the obvious harbors where Ottoman patrols were concentrated, de Robles executed a daring night landing at secluded Melia Bay on Malta's northern coast. His force then executed a moonlit march across the island, slipping through gaps in Turkish lines to reach Mdina. The fortress city's governor, Don Pedro de Mesquita, had prepared an audacious bluff. Though Medina housed barely 400 effective defenders, de Mesquita lined its walls with straw-stuffed dummies in armor and ordered every civilian to carry torches along the ramparts, creating the illusion of massive reinforcement. The psychological impact transcended the modest numbers. When Ottoman observers reported the Spanish arrival, panic rippled through Turkish ranks already exhausted by 3 months of combat in merciless heat. Desertion rates spiked, particularly among Arab auxiliaries who, underpaid and suffering from dysentery, slipped away by night toward the fleet. In Birgu's shattered streets, news of the relief ignited desperate hope. La Valette ordered the cathedral bells rung in celebration, their first use since May, and distributed the small quantities of wine that remained to toast deliverance. The reinforcement cut a path through to Birgu on August 28th, bringing not just fresh troops, but more crucially, powder and shot for the defenders' depleted magazines. Among de Robles' men were specialized marksmen who immediately began targeting Ottoman officers, creating havoc in the Turkish command structure. Mustafa, recognizing the psychological momentum shifting, ordered an all-or-nothing assault on September 1st, concentrating his remaining elite units against the post of Castile. The attack initially gained the wall top before La Valette. Despite his 70 years, personally led a countercharge that drove the attackers back in savage fighting, where men grappled with daggers and teeth after swords shattered. As the Turks retreated, leaving hundreds dead in the blood-slicked breach, a strange silence settled over the battlefield. The first pause in combat some defenders had experienced in weeks. In that unnatural quiet, both armies sensed the siege had reached its climactic phase. By early September, Malta had become a wasteland of scorched earth and shattered stone. The brutal Mediterranean summer was giving way to autumn storms, complicating Ottoman naval operations. Inside his tent on Mount Sybaris, Mustafa Pasha realized time was no longer his ally. His army had dwindled from 40,000 to fewer than 15,000 effective troops, the rest lost to combat, disease, and desertion. Worse, Turkish morale collapsed as whispers spread that the main Spanish relief force might truly be imminent. Summoning his remaining captains on September 7th, Mustafa delivered a stark ultimatum. "We will take Birgu within the week or face the Sultan's wrath as failures." He ordered one final, desperate assault. Every able-bodied man, including ship crews and camp followers, would participate in a massive human wave attack against multiple points of Birgu's perimeter. The attack began at dawn on September 8th, beneath a sky heavy with rain clouds. Ottoman troops surged forward with disciplined desperation, carrying scaling ladders, grappling hooks, and explosive charges. The Knights and Maltese defenders met them with terrible efficiency. Months of combat had honed their coordination to lethal precision. When Turkish sappers finally breached the wall near the post of Aragon, they encountered not confusion, but a prepared defense in depth. La Valette had anticipated the weak point and constructed interior barricades from dismantled buildings. As Ottoman forces poured through the breach, they funneled into a killing zone where crossfire from elevated positions decimated their ranks. The Grand Master himself led the counterattack, his armor dented and blood-spattered, his white beard visible beneath his helmet as he wielded a pike alongside common soldiers. The fighting raged through midday, bodies piling so high in some breaches that fresh attackers used them as grim stepping stones. By afternoon, even Ottoman command discipline began disintegrating. Junior officers refused suicidal orders, and entire companies retreated without authorization. As rain finally broke over the battlefield, Turkish forces withdrew in disorder, leaving over 3,000 dead. Watching from his command post, Mustafa reportedly tore at his beard in rage and despair. "Even these Christians, God fights for them now," he exclaimed, as thunder rolled across the harbor. That night, Ottoman war councils debated the unthinkable: abandonment of the siege before winter storms trapped their fleet in hostile waters. On September 7th, as Mustafa's final assault faltered at Birgu's walls, Don Garcia de Toledo's fleet finally departed Sicily with the long-promised Grande Soccorso. 8,000 veteran Spanish infantry embarked on 28 galleys, slipping into formation behind their flagship, Real. The viceroy had delayed for months, caught between King Philip II's cautious orders to avoid risking his precious Mediterranean fleet and the desperate pleas from Malta. Ottoman scout ships spotted the approaching armada on September 8th, sending riders galloping to Mustafa's headquarters with news that sealed the siege's fate. That same day, Turkish commanders ordered immediate evacuation, abandoning siege equipment and heavy artillery in their haste to re-embark before Spanish reinforcements could trap them against Malta's shores. The withdrawal quickly descended into chaos as discipline collapsed among exhausted troops. Janissary rearguards maintained order at embarkation points with whips and sabers, while Maltese irregulars harassed the retreating columns, picking off stragglers and capturing abandoned supplies. Don Garcia's relief force landed at Melilla Bay on September 8th to find the Ottoman army already disintegrating. Rather than immediately marching to Birgu, the Spanish commander deployed his fresh troops to cut off the Turkish retreat, creating a gauntlet through which Mustafa's rearguard had to fight. The resulting battle on Malta's northern plains became a slaughter as Spanish arquebusiers poured disciplined volley fire into the disorganized Ottoman columns. When Don Garcia finally reached Birgu on September 13th, he found a fortress that existed more in memory than reality. Scarcely a building remained intact, and the survivors who greeted him resembled spectral figures, emaciated and hollow-eyed. Valette received the viceroy in what remained of the Grand Master's palace, his once impressive frame now gaunt, but his one remaining eye still fierce with triumph. The old warrior had achieved what many considered impossible, outlasting an empire that had crushed every obstacle in its century-long expansion. Of the original 700 knights who began the siege, fewer than 250 remained alive, many bearing wounds that would never fully heal. As church bells rang across what remained of Malta's villages and towns, Europe gradually awakened to the magnitude of what had occurred on this small, rocky island. Christendom's eastern bulwark had held, and the Ottoman tide that had seemed unstoppable for a century had finally broken against the faith and steel of the Knights of St. John. When Suleiman the Magnificent received news of Malta's defense in his palace at Constantinople, the aging sultan reportedly fell into a rage so violent that courtiers feared for their lives. "I see nothing but my armies defeated, my treasures wasted, my empire shamed," he thundered. The siege had cost him over 30,000 men, irreplaceable janissaries and skilled artillerymen, along with his finest naval commanders and much of his Mediterranean prestige. For the first time, Ottoman expansion westward had not merely slowed, but reversed. The Sultan's final great gamble had failed, and with it died the dream of Islamic dominion over the Mediterranean. Suleiman would launch no more grand campaigns. He died the following year while leading a lesser expedition against Habsburg forces in Hungary, his final thoughts reportedly fixed on the Malta debacle. On Malta itself, La Valette wasted no time in rebuilding. 8 days after the siege lifted, he laid the foundation stone of a new fortified city on Mount Sybaris, the very hill from which Ottoman guns had battered St. Elmo. Named Valette in his honor, this planned city embodied lessons learned in blood, with massive bastions, interlocking fields of fire, and a revolutionary grid street pattern designed for rapid military response. Pope Pius V sent his top military architect, Francesco Laparelli, while European monarchs competed to fund the construction, suddenly recognizing the knights as Christendom's indispensable shield. As construction crews cleared siege debris, they uncovered a staggering 130,000 cannonballs fired during the 112-day ordeal, metal that was promptly melted down to strengthen the new fortifications. When La Valette died in 1568, he was entombed beneath his new city, his epitaph reading simply, "Here lies La Valette, who feared nothing but deserved everything." The Great Siege had transformed a minor military order into legends and converted a barren rock into the most formidable fortress in the Mediterranean, an island bulwark that would remain unconquered for another 233 years, until Napoleon himself finally claimed what Suleiman could not. Retrimotabubadye.